My name's Steve Banham, and I'm here to talk about type, of course. I feel like I'm staring at God at the moment. I think I can see any of you. That's okay. I'll just look beyond the light at the people. So you'll have to avoid my squinting. I'll try to run up and down the room to try to circumvent that effect. Right, okay. A funny thing happened to me the other day when I was wheeling my trolley around IKEA, is that I came along to this area here, which is normally full of really crappy prints of landscapes and really bad reproductions of Rihanna or whatever. And instead of that, I saw these, which are, of course, European sans serifs that you can buy to hang in your lounge room. Now, I thought that was extraordinary, the fact that this stuff, type, has now entered such an extraordinary kind of mainstream level that you can actually furnish your house with type. And a lot of people do, even if they're not graphic designers or typographers or anybody interested in stuff. Then I started looking around at other shops, and I even went into Kmart. And in Kmart, as opposed to the IKEA $69 version, you can get an $8 crappy script. So, and that can be hung in your room, in your house as well, which I thought was interesting, but you know, a little bit less elegant, but still there. You can even now buy clothing, in this particular case, tights. This woman here has Helvetica tights, and they're so tight you can see that they're beginning to induce a headache. This is quite extraordinary. This, for somebody like me who's been doing this stuff for sort of 30 years, since about the mid-80s or thereabouts, this is extraordinary to see typography really entering the mainstream. It's really part of the broader kind of cultural conversation. Staying with the Helvetica theme just for a moment, there's an ad here. This is from Plush, I think it is, the sofa people. Now, you know, here's these people, and of course there's the sofas. You can get it in vermilion, macchiato, black and white, but of course the sofa, of course, is called Helvetica. Now, I've never had that much fun with Helvetica in almost 30 years, and I would certainly be into Helvetica if it was always that great, but it's not. But isn't it extraordinary that you can sort of not only look at typeface on your wall, you can all, of course, sit on a couch, also called Helvetica. This is absolutely extraordinary. So, why are we beginning to invest this kind of meaning or our sense of self into typography, which we never used to do? A very interesting experiment by a photographer called James Molson maybe goes some way to suggest what's going on. He did this fantastic thing where he would go to very large stadium performances by big, high-profile kind of singers or bands, and he would ask various people from the audience to come backstage where he would take photographs of them. Needless to say, this is a Cure concert. And of course, what he's got there is this weird assemblage of young men who are just trying to do their best to look like Robert Smith in varying levels of success or otherwise. He then, of course, replicated it at a Dolly Parton concert. And you can see, again, the same investment of the self in this pop music. Missy Elliott concert, same process. This is 50 Cent concert, and again, these young men are trying to look more criminal than the guy next to them. And this is an interesting one. This is a Björk concert, okay? Now, Björk, of course, is fantastic at being able to change, you know. She has no set identity. She's smart enough, and I'd say kind of agile enough, to be able to reinvent herself. So this hasn't got the same sort of monocultural complexion that these other slides have. I think that's kind of the most interesting. And of course, they're all female, which is interesting. Lastly, and perhaps more scarier than anything I can think of course, is the George Michael concert. And this has got all of these middle-aged men all trying to look like George Michael. I mean, Jesus Christ, why? Why? But what this tells us, of course, is that they're trying to adopt the clothes that say something about their personal identity. Now, if we would actually strip this back to typography now, to look at the same thing but looking at it through a kind of typographic lens, then of course we have a look at the various forms of identity. The Cure, of course, have reinvented themselves many, many times over. Dolly is all very pink and kind of girly and fluid and intimate and scripty with a little butterfly. Missy Elliott is trying to be a little bit mischievous, a little bit criminal. There's that stencil thing going on there with a slight hint of sort of the illegal use of stencils. 50 Cent is bold and sort of unapologetic and really kind of thick. And then we have Bjork, Bjork has no identity at all. She keeps on changing, like the girls that we saw before. George Michael, of course, looks a bit like a kind of, menswear store in Chadstone or something, Very, very middle of the road. Very middle of the road. So you can see that there's a parallel between physical identity and typographic identity. It's all kind of running in tandem. So that's one of the reasons why I called this particular talk The Clothes That Words Wear. This, of course, is not my own title. It's actually a title by Eric Spiekermann, who's a German type designer and typographer. So what I thought I'd do is just because this is a really short kind of talk, I'm just trying to skim across type and what it means and what you can do with it and so forth. So this is looking at leverage, how people can leverage from pre-existing forms. Okay, so here we have the dog father, Snoop Doggy Dog. Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to what this is trying to riff off? Yeah, that's right. And of course, the dog father is not the only one. The Fugees have done it, and other groups as well. They are, of course, as you said, riffing perfectly off this one here, which is the typography, hand-drawn typography, I should add, for the Godfather book from 1969. So it's actually. And actually, it did surprise me that it was actually from 1969 when I was doing this research. But that is, of course, as I said, a custom font, which you can now purchase that and use that anywhere around the place. But of course, pop music is full of these kind of typographic schisms or reference points. I suspect that a lot of you probably know this band. Kiss, of course, were huge in the 1970s, 80s. I think Gene Simmons, is coming out soon, or I don't know. He always seems to be out here. But the extraordinary thing about this, of course, the story behind this, well, it's twofold. One, Ace Frehley says that he designed the logo. I don't know whether that's true or not. In 1974. But what's particularly disturbing about this sort of corporate identity, if you want to call it that, is that, of course, half of it refers to something that is rather more sinister, which of course is the SS identity from the Nazi period. And of course, because half the members of KISS are Jewish, this was particularly poignant, and I would say very, very inflammatory to that community. So the great thing about typography is that you can kind of trace its trail through graphic design, and it can be quite a lot of fun. So you can pick any piece of graphic design and do this kind of run back. So I've picked this one here. This is an album cover by Lady GaGa from 2008. Okay. Now, does anybody want to guess as to why do you think Lady GaGa has kind of used that style of typography?
To be bold.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what kind of musician she was. Well, she is. She's a very bold and in-your-face person.
Yes. And she's also hinting though at a particularly when it's combined with that image. There's a sort of a fashion kind of element to it as well. That she's using what we call a hairline serif typeface. Now, where have we seen a hairline serif typeface used in the fashion industry?
The Vogue magazine.
That's right. So we begin to track it back, but we in fact can track it back in between this and Vogue. Here we have some instances of where people have ripped off. So of course, this is the album Dare by Human League. I'm assuming some of you know who Human League are. That's a classic kind of new romantic band, of course. And Human League branding. What's so clever about it is that, of course, half of the word league is GUE. And, of course, they completely ripped that off, as you pointed out. Vogue, you can see that it's a complete and utter take off that because it's inferring fashion, style, a higher status, all that kind of stuff. So you can see this lineage going through. That's Shirt, believe it or not, from 1972 on the front cover of Vogue. But of course, we see it now. I mean, it could be argued that Vogue is still trading off its kind of status from many, many years ago. But we see even in contemporary branding, this is a really wanky sort of campaign for South Yarra Essence, and you can see that this is completely taken off Vogue, and that's just from 2014. Of course, I'm from Brunswick, and we have a more kind of downer version. This is the fashion store, Madame Vogue. Who the hell's Madame Vogue? Lingerie, with that beautiful blurred drop shadow behind it as well, just to add that little panache. Needless to say, that went under in about 6 months, that particular reference there. And the point being that you can see this kind of lineage that runs right through everything, and the conduit, of course, is typography. But typography can also capture a particular point in time, a zeitgeist, as the Germans call it, the spirit of the times. So, for example, I certainly don't want to condone drugs in any way. For those who don't know what this is an ecstasy tablet. I'm sure at a gaming conference none of you know what drugs are. And so this is an ecstasy tablet, of course, which is a huge part of the 1990s rave kind of culture. So if we look at the 1990s, we look at what was going on in contemporary art during this stage. This is, of course, one of Damien Hirst's very early works. It's called Pharmacy and the Tate, where he completely reproduced a pharmacy, actual size, it was a real pharmacy, except it didn't have drugs in it. And that's it. So you can see that there's a conduit running through there, and of course if you look at the typography of the bands during that period, you can see this same reference. So the point that I'm making here is that typography is and can be used as an incredibly powerful indicator of a particular time. So let's do a little bit of a trace back, not with Lady Gaga this time, but with Rihanna. So there she is, looking very stylish indeed in 2005 for Music at the Sun. And you can see that there's this perfect relationship between the imagery and the typography. So she's, for example, wearing glow mesh, which is a symbol of the kind of 1970s disco kind of period. She's got super duper high gloss lipstick, works really nicely. She's got big bangles, and so that's all very kind of disco 1970s. And the typography there, of course, is of a particular style. It's called the swash caps, which is the R. It's a particular kind of ornate R running through there. So she is clearly using the typography and the photographic styling to indicate the 1970s. But where is she ripping off stuff? Well, of course, during around about that time, swash caps were enormously fashionable and still are. And they were primarily popular during this time because of an advent in technology called open type format, or OTF, which allows typefaces within the one font file to have huge numbers of variations of alternatives so that you can create that. So that was going on during that time as both fashion and technology. And of course, this is not the first time that this has happened. Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown from 1997, of course, to try to capture the essence of the 70s, he used swash caps beautifully through that. Swash caps, of course, actually came into huge popularity in the 1970s, so this is the real 1970s. This is a title for a book. I forget what I mean, Kama Sutra. How 1971 is that? Because it's so fitting, because each letter appears to be kind of licking and sort of wrapping itself around each other. It's an incredibly expressive piece of work given the actual content. And I'm sure you've seen swash caps appearing on all sorts of album covers during this period. This is the kind of treatment that you see in those, those German records that you get at op shops for $1, Herman Hansberry's organ hits or something. It's always, that kind of stuff. This is the kind of spirit of that. But of course, swash caps actually go right back to, of course, the Caslon swash of 1730. So you can see that there's this big lineage here where this is the first revival, then there's a second revival, a third revival, and it'll just keep going and going and going and going. It's quite a strange period. But of course, that's all historical. Let's look at the now. Let's look at the kind of things, the cultural spirit of the now, which I guess you could say includes some of these things like the gig economy. We're always told that we live in that. I think that's probably just a way of being able to justify not paying people properly. Economic disruption, and I must say, I'm warning us about to have some terrible cliched words coming up. Flexible, mobile, the pop-up culture, and agile. Okay, so they're all there. So that is kind of a picture of supposedly our society today. So how is that typographically reflected? What particular style is popular these days? Well, of course, stencil typefaces are hugely popular these days because they indicate a certain permanence, a certain temporary aspect. It's flexible, it's mobile, it's not for sort of long term. There's this inference that it's always going to move on. Similarly, if you look at the now, of course, we have a supposed yearning for authenticity, whatever that is. Intimacy, an antidote for disconnection. We want community, we want it to be personal, we want it to be individual. So of course, what do we see coming up in fashion is of course script typefaces. And if you go into any cafe, anywhere in the city, you'll see the usual hipster script, kind of chalkboard kind of stuff. It's all over the place. And so these speak to those kind of cultural demands or cultural feelings. Oh, right, okay, sorry. I tend to wander around a bit. Yep. So, does anybody want to hazard a guess? Now, we've actually moved from time to space, an area. Does anybody want to guess as to, if you saw this somewhere, where in the world you would be? Where does it remind you of? Germany. That's interesting. Does anybody think it looks English? Like those old English books that you would read as a kid? Yep, Monopoly, that's right. Because this typeface, of course, is a typeface called Johnston, and it's designed for the underground in London. It was designed by Edward Johnston, who was the teacher of Eric Gill. You might have heard of Gill Sans. It's a pretty common typeface. Gill Sans. So this is quintessentially English. When you see this, you almost hear the voice of the sort of English narrator speaking those particular words. Now, I've always been interested in this idea of place and typography. I wrote a book for Thames and Hudson about it called Characters, which was a very simple proposition. And that was that you can actually read a city through its typography rather than read it through its architecture. You know how everybody thinks of cities as architecturally mapped. And you can do that. And for this particular book, of course, I chose Melbourne as the case study because I'm born and bred in Melbourne and I know it very, very well. And there's a particular complexion to each city, which is a sort of typographic expression. This is, for example, a snapshot of Melbourne. You only get signs like that in Melbourne. So you begin to get this sense of a locality. This locality can manifest itself in some really weird places. There's an old toilet block just on the outskirts of Deer Park, which is in the sort of outer west of, northwest of Melbourne. And I was looking at, and you can see this toilet block from the highway as you're driving along, tiny little thing. And what it actually is, it's a toilet block from what used to be a lion park. And unbeknownst to me before I wrote this book, there was a whole series of lion parks that were sort of ringing Melbourne in the 1970s. Because what happened in the 1970s, there was a huge cultural love of Tarzan, Daktari, all these other kind of shows that were around about, you know, African native stuff. And so there was a whole series of lion parks that started up. This is all that is left of this lion park. Many of these lion parks were closed down because little children were mauled to death particularly by immigrant families who would actually spread a picnic blanket out in the park, thinking that it was fine to have a picnic. And so a lot of these picnic sort of park went under. So you can see that this is the very last traces of these really unusual kind of cultural artefacts. So we had to wait for sunset to set that night when we went out there. And I swear, I've never seen so many drug trades in 2 or 3 hours than out of this toilet block. It was quite extraordinary. But it's just an example of these little kind of sort of typographic traces of our city and what they mean. You may know this one. This is in Abbotsford Convent. And this is a real oddity, this one, because, of course, it's not in English. It's in French. And you would walk past and think, why have they got a French kind of shopfront thing going on in Abbotsford Convent in Melbourne, Australia? It doesn't make any sense. Well, of course, what you're looking at there is actually a film set that was built in 1987 for a film about Nancy Wake, who was a spy in the Second World War. She was a New Zealand woman who helped the French resistance, blah, blah, blah. You know, that they shot this film in the Abbotsford Convent, and they made that as a little film, a film set. When the Abbotsford Convent had a protective law over the whole covenant to stop it being developed, which was good, what that also did, that protected all of this. So this is now sort of embalmed in a protective seal. It's kind of like the whole thing's in aspic. And so this, of course, continues to be one of the most photographed backdrops for bridal shoots in Melbourne. I mean, second only to Hosier Lane, I believe. Quite strange. But of course, typography can be extraordinarily subversive as well. So it's not always at the service of capitalism. This is Centre Place Arcade, which runs in between Flinders Lane and Collins Street in the city. One part of Centre Place is very beautiful. It's been preserved and it's full of cafes and, you know, heaps of fashion photo shoots and all that kind of stuff. The other half of Centre Place was, of course, renovated in the early 1990s. You can tell by the glass bricks and everything. It's sort of got that kind of Pat Benatar kind of feel about it when you walk in. It's very 80s. But on one of the walls is this extraordinary kind of mesh of brass Helvetica uppercase letters, which no one ever looks at, no one ever sees. But if you look up and if you begin to read it, it has no word spacing. But if you begin to insert words, insert spaces where there should be spaces, it actually spells something out. It spells out a statement which says, we live in a society that sets an inordinate value on consumer goods and services. Now this, of course, is in an arcade. So it is incredibly subversive as a message, and yet, of course, it's just sitting there, silently just sitting there, and no one notices it. There's an old saying which is, there's no such thing as a bad typeface, just bad typography. This is the Dutch design critic Geoffrey Keedy. But of course, there are, of course, typefaces that are much maligned, and this, of course, is Comic Sans. Of course, people are very unfair about Comic Sans because they expect it to do the job of Helvetica or Times when, in fact, it's not really meant for that at all. And this is really bringing up a key sort of aspect of typography, which is it's not about whether it's bad or good, it's about whether it's appropriate. That should be the absolute criteria, single criteria, one might say. So Comic Sans, of course, was designed for this weird thing called Microsoft Bold, which is this thing. But of course, it was first used in 3D Movie Maker in 1995. Now, if you want to see what 3D Movie Maker looks like, because I sure as hell didn't have it, it looked like that. Yeah, and boy, that's crude by contemporary standards. In fact, it's probably crude even then. But you can see it starring up there at the top there. You know, would you like to make a movie with Melanie? Would you like to? Would you like to? You know, spoon your eyes out with this typeface. It's so fucking ugly. It's the options are there. But of course, appropriateness is a very interesting thing, because when you're presented with work that you absolutely hate, like this stuff, for example, this. Does anybody want to have a guess as to what musical genre this might be? Any guesses? Yeah, of course.
Country and Western.
Very close, very, very close. Yeah. I mean, if you're into heavy metal, you know, great, whatever. But this, I look at this stuff, I hate it. I can't even read it, or whatever. Because of course, I'm not a 14-year-old boy, am I? That's not what it's meant for. So it's the thing about this, I hate it, but it's perfectly and absolutely appropriate because it's visceral, it's tribal, it's all those things that, of course, you want to be when you're a kind of angry young man. Similarly, of course, I also hate this stuff when we kind of move from these gendered spaces. Of course, we're beginning to move into a kind of visual language that we would normally associate with girls. And it's got all of the qualities, you know, the supposed intimacy, you know, this idea that Britney Spears is sitting in the corner of some factory in China, handwriting on the front of every single CD. I mean, you know, really, it's ridiculous. And Celine, for God's sake, I mean, that is so beautifully and professionally rendered. That hasn't gone anywhere near Celine Dion. Of course, it's interesting when these things blur. Yeah. And speaking of blurring and mixing messages, of course, we are beginning to see this weird cross-pollination of identities. This kind of work you would normally associate with a fashion boutique, a high status jewellery store, something like that, maybe handbags. But of course, all of these works are, of course, corporate identities for apartment blocks. And there's a really good reason for that, of course, because the architecture is so incredibly generic, because it's all built to, you know, to economics, that the more the architecture becomes generic, the more they have to really, really, really hype up the branding around it. So there's a really curious inverse kind of correlation going on there. So can we actually avoid typographic meaning? Is it actually possible to have a typeface that says nothing? Of course, the Swiss tried that with Neu-Haskotesk or Helvetica in 1957, and we all know that Helvetica, in fact, is not neutral at all. There, in fact, is no such thing as neutrality in type. It's a bit like looking at all of your faces now. I'm seeing a spectrum from extraordinary engagement to nearly falling asleep, and I'm seeing all of that spectrum, and your faces are very much like typefaces. But what I tried to do, of course, was to test this theory. So I took a piece of graffiti which was in Elizabeth Street. This is an anarchist thing, broken anarchist. It's spray painted. It's got the anarchist symbol on it. It's, again, perfectly appropriate typography if you're pissed off and you want to, you know, state your case on the streets of Melbourne. Completely fine. But of course, if you were to erase that and actually respray that in Helvetica, you can see what I'm talking about. This is the voice of authority. This is the voice of the empowered. There is no neutrality. There is no doubt about that. So any idea that you can be neutral is a complete fallacy. So if we go back to Rihanna, of course, the power of type is so incredibly strong that we can do all sorts of things to Rihanna. So we can make her look Swiss and neutral and cold, or conversely, of course, we can make her look really cheap and nasty, like she should be in the discount bargain bin. So this is the power of typography. So this is really what I'm here to extol the virtues of today. Typography, the power of typography. Don't view it as something that comes in at the very last minute. It should be fundamental to all of the planning. And that is the end of my talk, but I certainly welcome any questions.